There's the sign. Okay, well, welcome everyone to this January episode, we might say, of the IHR Digital History Seminar. Happy New Year to those we haven't spoken to or seen. I know it feels a little bit late in the year. We are absolutely delighted today to have two wonderful speakers presenting a paper called Orientalist Pixels, who I will come to talk about in a second. But before we start, a few housekeeping elements. Our speakers will, of course, give their paper. And we ask that all questions come at the end of said paper. You are welcome to put questions in the chat, or if you would like to kind of do it verbally, you are also welcome to turn your camera on, use your microphone, however you so wish, at the end of their paper. So please just let us know. Another reminder that, of course, this is being recorded, so please do bear that in mind if you do not want your video on. But of course, we welcome you to have your video on. So that leads us to then introduce our wonderful speakers for today. So we have on the one screen there, not coming from separate places today, we have Thomas Smits, who is an assistant professor of digital history and AI at the University of Amsterdam. He's a historian of modern visual news culture, and most of his work is located at the intersection of media history, media studies, and digital humanities. He applies digital methods to study large collections of historical illustrations, photographs, and other images. We also have Melvin Wevers, who's an assistant professor of computational history at the University of Amsterdam. His work focuses on extracting historical structures from archival data and quantifying historical processes through machine learning. He's particularly interested in uncovering bias and examining issues of representation in cultural heritage collections using computational methods. His research spans multimodal AI, digital history, and cultural analytics, with applications to historical newspapers, advertisements, and archival metadata. Now, the paper for today is entitled Orientalist Pixels, How Machine Learning Reveals the Colonial Color Palette of Early Photography. And so I will pass over to our wonderful speakers for today and see you on the other side for questions.
Yes, thank you very much for that kind introduction and also for the invitation. So James told us that people usually present work in progress in the seminar, but we will today do something slightly different because we will present work that is already published. So you can see the article in Humanities and Social Sciences Communications here. And that article is Coloring in the World of Others, Color Use in Visual Orientalism, 1819 to 1920. So what we will do today is basically first give you some background about sort of our joint project that Melvin and I have, which involves applying multimodal AI to study historical visual culture. Then I will give some background into visual Orientalism, so what it is and how can we study it using computational methods. Then I will hand it over to Melvin, who will do the research questions, the data, and the methods. And then we will discuss the results and have some questions at the end, questions that we still have after doing this research. So, as I already mentioned, this research is sort of part of a joint project that Melvin and I are involved in since around 2017, I guess. And in this project, we apply multimodal AI to study historical visual news culture. And there has been a very rapid development here. So when we started out, everything was computer vision related, so object detection and image classification. Then it became multimodal AI, the machine learning methods that learn from the connection between text and images. Now we're, of course, at vision language models, so a sort of combination of ChatGPT that can also read images. And you can see some of our articles here. So we have been sort of also involved in trying to describe this shift in sort of more conceptual ways. But we have always been interested in the question if you can also use more, so to say, basic techniques, so basic machine learning techniques to answer the same kind of questions, right? So these questions about historical visual culture. So that is sort of the larger question of this talk. Can we actually use machine learning, basic machine learning, to empirically demonstrate theories about historical visual culture at scale? So the background of our talk today is visual Orientalism. That's of course linked to the work of Edward Said, right? Orientalism, in which he defined, or in which he sort of posits that the West defines itself by contrasting its own self-image with the imagined world of the Oriental other, right? So Said stated that the Orient was represented as static, or underdeveloped, and non-rational, right? And this is all, of course, the contrasting image of that the West had of itself. And more positively, at least for some writers and painters in the 19th century, it was also seen as a very sort of a mysterious, sensual, and maybe also sexual, inhibited, sorry, difficult word for a Dutch speaker, world, sorry. So a world of mysterious customs, strong smells, and most importantly for our research, also very intense colors. So Said focused almost exclusively on text, but other scholars sort of extended his theories to visual culture. And I'm thinking here especially of Linda Noslin, who wrote a wonderful essay about Orientalist paintings, right? So she talks about the work of Eugène Delacroix and Gérôme, two very famous 19th century French painters. And in fact, one of Gérôme's paintings, the snake charmer, which you can see here on the slide, was also used on the cover of Edward Said's book. So others have extended Said's work to photography, right? So not only painting, but also photography as an Orientalist tradition. And here, photography is not seen to provide a more objective picture of countries in the Near of Middle East, right? So it's just as Orientalist as Orientalist painting was. So in fact, it fixed and stabilized Orientalist stereotypes of painting by presenting them through the sort of the mechanical nature of photography as objective facts. And these mass-produced images further democratized access to these fictional representations, right? So they became much more widespread. And most studies of visual Orientalism focus very much on content, right? So they both in painting and photography. So they talk about these themes that we see, like the harem, the bathhouse, the palm trees, the camels, the minarets, right? All these themes that we know from visual Orientalism. But in his wonderful book from 2003, Roger Benjamin also stated that Orientalism developed a distinctive visual aesthetic, right? And one of the most important challenges of this aesthetic for painters and photographers was that they hoped to capture the very vivid colors of the Orient, right? So this is again about these rich colors. So this is sort of the background, and then we started our research with two photographic collections, and these basically represent two new color media to capture the colors of the Orient around the turn of the 20th century, right? So on the one hand, we have the photochrome, a technique which was invented around the 1890s. And this is a lithographic technique where printers added colors, so very highly realistic colors, to black and white images and then printed them using different tint stones. So this is all a printing technique. And on the other hand, we have autochrome, which was invented by the Lumiere brothers, who also invented cinema. And this is a photomechanical technique. So here, the colors of a photograph are directly derived from light, right? So these are two basic ways to make make color photography possible. But in the one hand, we have black and white photographs that are colored in. And in the other hand, we have autochromes where colors are derived from light. Yeah.
Let's see. So we took this theoretical framework that Thomas just explained about visual Orientalism, and we tried to use that to ask questions relating to these two different media types, so the autochromes and the photochromes. And the question that we were pursuing is, can can different color media actually produce different color palettes? So are these actually different? Well, at a first glance, we saw some differences in the pictures that Thomas just showed, but can we use computation to distinguish at scale whether there's a difference between photochromes and autochromes solely based on their colors? And then the second question we pose is, can we use these differences in colors to also distinguish between representations of the Orient, so let's say the East, and the Occident, the West, across these different color media. So there's different color media. They might represent different things. Do they also use different colors to represent these two different aspects of the world, these visual representations? And then zooming in even more, and perhaps most importantly for understanding how visual Orientalism is constructed, is does the presence, but also the absence of specific colors define these geographic imaginaries? And through these three questions that I will get into in a bit, we want to test long-standing theories about visual Orientalism using machine learning. So these sort of basic machine learning techniques that Thomas just explained. But in order to ask these questions and to apply them to these autochromes and photochromes, we first needed to collect the data sets. So what we did, we constructed two different digitized collections that we derived from archives, that we extracted from archives. We took 6,500 photochromes from the National Library of Congress in the US, dating from 1890 to 1910. And then secondly, we collected about 65,000 autochromes from the Albert Kahn collection in France, which was created between 1909 and 1931. So we had a collection of autochromes and a collection of photochromes, and we used the metadata of these collections to derive whether the representation on these images was representing the Occident or the Orient. And then we used this to sort of do a geographic categorization that we also checked. And as you can see, we ended up within the photochrome, someone at our door, with 4,000 Occident images and about 370 Orient images. And for autochromes, this was much more evenly divided. But as you can immediately see, there was a huge imbalance between the photochromes and the autochromes in terms of the representation of the Orient. So this is something that we had to take in the back of mind when applying the machine learning, that this affects machine learning, and we have to take this into account when constructing the classification approach. So this is the data that we had. Then we had to find a way to answer the questions, the three research questions that we posed. And for this, we went through 5 steps that I will now briefly present, and then in more detail, I will discuss every single step. So the 5 steps entailed k-means clustering to extract dominant colors from each image. So basically the colors that were most present in each image. Then we calculated the relative frequency of these colors, so how present was each color in the image. And then third, we placed these colors into what we call color buckets across the entire collection. So the dominant colors are calculated based on an image by image step. So each image has a couple of dominant colors, and then we, for the entire collection, put them in buckets. But I will explain this in a bit more detail in a second. And then we use something called a random forest classification that use these buckets to answer our questions. And lastly, and this is a very hot topic now, explainable machine learning or explainable AI. We use the technique called Shapley additive explanations to sort of open up the black box of machine learning to investigate like what are the actual colors that were driving the classification to make a certain decision. And this allows us to move beyond just reporting accuracy scores of machine learning, so how well does the classifier work, to also understand which colors matter for distinguishing between categories for answering the questions. So now let me walk you through these 5 steps in a bit more detail. So these are actually the first 2 steps in concert. And what we see here in these 2 figures is the original images on the top. On the left, we see an Orientalist photochrome showing pyramids, and on the right, we see an autochrome showing a mosque. And here we see that we used the k-means clustering to extract the dominant colors, so 16 of them. The size of the bars indicates the relative frequency of these colors. And immediately looking at these dominant colors, we see how they correspond to the actual images. You can sort of, if you squint through your eyelashes, you can see these colors. But also you can see the relative, the presence of these images represented there. And this weighting is important of the colors, because a color that appears in just 2% of an image should have less influence than a color that covers, well, let's say 30% of an image. And this is also something that we will get back to later when talking, for example, about objects. And objects could be very significant, but small. But here we actually look at the entire color palette and how it is used across the image. So this is on an image by image level. For every single image in the collection, we extracted these 16 dominant colors and calculated the relative frequencies. And then the third step is this bucketing step. And the reason why we did this is that we've done this for thousands of images, these dominant colors, but you can imagine that if you're trying to describe or extract the color of sand across images, you end up with dominant colors that are basically slightly similar to the human eye. You would basically say they're both like sand colors. But if you would transcribe it to actual values, a value that a computer understands, which are also called RGB values, these could be completely different values. So for a computer, the value being different makes a difference, whereas to the way we perceive it as humans, they're actually quite similar. So for this reason, we didn't want to treat every tiny variation as something unique, but we want to generalize over these colors within the collection. So basically putting all the sandy colors together, all the sort of sky blue colors together. And for this, we created these buckets. So you can see this basically as this cube that we see, where we divided this in 3 dimensions. So the R for red, green, and blue. So these 3 components of a color. And you can slice this up in equidistant slices, basically. You could do 8 per side, ending up with 8 times 8 times 8, which is 512 buckets. But you could also slice it up more or even less. So the idea is when we have these buckets and we would extract the color, we could place it in a bucket. So it's somewhere in this color range of this specific bucket. And we've tried this for multiple bucket sizes to see what works best. Because if you have too many buckets, you still get a lot of data. If you have too few buckets, you might put too many colors in one bucket. So it was a sort of an optimization step that we did to find the best number of buckets. And 512 for us was the best number of buckets. So then we have these buckets. We've put everything in buckets. But we still needed to do the classification task to answer the question, do autochromes use different colors than photochromes? Is the Orient represented differently than the Occident within autochromes and photochromes? And for this, we used a method called random forest classification. It's a machine learning method that's been around for quite a long time. Basically, what this does is you can imagine it as sort of a voting panel where you beforehand don't define how many voters you have. So you test for different sizes. So you have an option where you have 5, well, I say people now, but I don't really mean people, but you have 5 voters. You could have 10 voters, 20, up to 200. And what you do is you train each voter on different subsets of the data. So you give them different sections of the data. And what they have to do is answer the question, is this an autochrome or a photochrome? And can I make this decision based on the information that I get? So the bucket information that I get. And by having multiple voters, you basically control for the fact that the data might be skewed in some way. So remember before I said that there was a class imbalance. There weren't that many Orient images. So by using this random forest classification, by using many different voters that you expose to different parts of the data, you can account for these differences. But of course, there is a point where you can add more and more voters, but you don't really get any better results anymore. So that's, again, an optimization step. So in a way, you can see this forest as a collection of independent decision makers that overall lead to, well, a good decision, hopefully. Let's see if that's everything I wanted to say about this. Oh yeah, so and important is that this controls for the fact that you, because we have more images in one collection, that the model becomes very good at doing just one thing, and then you get an overall score saying the model is, yeah, in 80% of the cases it's correct, but that is sort of not shedding light on the fact that there's a class imbalance. Random forest classification does account for this, so it's a good choice to use that in this case. So we ran this, we optimized this, and in the paper you can find the final optimization steps that go a bit too far for now. But the results, that's always interesting, I think. And for us, these results are also the results, and that I already prime you, is that a not so good result for us is also an interesting result. And I get to this in a second. But let's start with the first question. Can we distinguish photochromes from autochromes? Yes, we can, with 0.95 accuracy. So in 95% of the cases, we can say whether it's one or the other. It's a high accuracy, and it confirms that these two media types do indeed have distinct color palettes. And then we looked into a specific collection. So within the collection of photochromes, can we distinguish Oriental from Occidental images? Yes, we can, with 93% accuracy. And this is purely based on color use. So no direct, we didn't take into account the actual objects that are being represented. So this suggests that color was systematically used differently when depicting these two imaginaries within the same media type, so within the photochrome media type. But for autochromes, we see that the accuracy actually drops to 0.68, which is, well, barely better than flipping a coin. Like that's half, it's 0.5. So it's only slightly better than a random choice made by the classifier. So a task that works really well for the photochromes fails for these autochromes. So this does tell us something on what might be happening here, and we'll get to that in the conclusion as well. But that still leaves us with the third research question: does the presence or absence of specific colors define visual Orientalism? So we now know we can make a difference between the two, but what is driving this difference? So for that, we turn to these SHAP values, this explainable AI technique. These graphs can be a bit daunting at first, but I'll try to walk you through it. So what we see here is basically rows that represent color buckets. So on the left of the graph, we see these numbers, and these correspond to one of these buckets in this space of 512 buckets. And underneath the graph, you can see the average color for each bucket. So a bucket contains multiple colors, as I said before, but you can sort of calculate the average color of the bucket. This is just for explanatory purposes. And these are the top 5 most influential buckets driving the decision making. And on the x-axis, so the horizontal axis, we see the SHAP value that indicates the impact that the color's presence or absence has on the model's prediction. So whenever a color is to the left of the middle, it pushes the prediction towards autochrome, whereas on the right, so if it's a higher SHAP value, it pushes it to the photochrome. So this is about the photochrome autochrome distinguishing. And what we see here, if we take a look at bucket 146, the sort of gray greenish color, we can see a lot of blue dots on the left of the middle. That means that when a color is absent, so the blue is when it's absent from an image, it strongly predicts the autochrome. And on the right, we see pink dots. So that means when the color is present, it suggests photochrome. So the color indicates whether it's absent or present, and then the position, is it to the left or the right of the middle, indicates whether it's either autochrome or photochrome. So this helps us understand, like, is the absence or the presence of a color pushing it towards a certain direction? And what does this tell us is that these that the media themselves, because they were made in a different way, they perhaps couldn't produce exactly the same colors. And for the photochrome printing process, it might have been difficult to create the colors in buckets 146, 438, and 365, so the top three, while the autochrome struggled with bucket 229. So it's a inverse of the same thing. So for us, this is sort of evidence that color perception is mediated by technology. That the medium defined like what colors you could use, and then also what colors were being selected, and that also drove if we wanted to represent a certain geography, we would go for certain colors, but this would be determined in part by the medium itself. So very briefly, for a second classifier, we looked at the difference within photochromes, because that's the only one in which we could make a difference between Occident and Orient. Also at the Shep values. And here, basically, we also see that there's particular colors, and I won't go into all the details, that really show that an absence of a color pushes it into a certain direction, whereas the presence pushes it sometimes to another direction, or sometimes is also weak. So we see this interplay between absence and presence of colors, and not just the presence of the color. Of course, and this is maybe something for the discussion as well, we looked at colors now. We said we didn't look at content. But of course, colors are in a way correlating with some objects. Some objects just have a certain color. So it could well be that these colors correspond to specific objects. But we try to take a step back and just focus on the colors here. I think it's now back to you, Thomas. So these are all the results, and we continue with the conclusions that we drew from these results.
Yeah. So now for the short ending, some more general conclusions. Like the first conclusion based on the performance of our random forest classification is that color sense became mediated in the late 19th century, right? So this basically says that the colors we see depend on the media that we use, right? And this is also something for the first time in history, basically, when color media start to appear, that influences which colors we can see in the world and how we see the world through these colors. So the second conclusion is that in photochromes, so where a printer added color, the presence and absence of specific color was a vital aspect of visual Orientalism, right? So this conclusion, or this sort of performance of our classification algorithm, in fact, is empirical proof for visual Orientalism, right? So the influence of aesthetics on visual Orientalism. So this was a theory, and now we have sort of proof for it, and that's at least our sort of what we think that we did. So in the end, autochromes, where color was derived from light, provided in fact a more objective picture of countries in the Near and Middle East than photochromes. And this sort of goes against the general sort of direction of the historiography, right? Where they say like, okay, photography does not provide a more objective picture of the Orient. It is in fact a continuation of the tradition of painting. So here we see where autochromes, where light gives the picture's colors, does in fact present a more neutral picture of the world. Right. So these are our main conclusions. And before we come to some more discussion questions, we also wanted to address very shortly the question of close reading, right? So in lots of digital humanities research, researchers oscillate between distant and close forms of analysis. And in this study, we intentionally avoided close reading any pictures. And this is something which is hard for me to do because these pictures are so fascinating, but we intentionally avoided it. And we did so because we think it would distract from our central argument, right? That color serves as a subtle but very powerful predictor of visual Orientalism. And this, because as Melvin already mentioned, our predictor or our classification algorithms not only take into account the presence of things, so things that you can actually see on a photograph, but also the absence of things. And this reading patterns of absence is especially hard to do when you close read an image, right? It is very hard to notice something which is conspicuously not there. And therefore, we also think that close reading is not very well suited in to answer these sorts of questions because it's you cannot basically as a researcher don't see things that are not there, or it's at least very hard to sort of make any argument about that. Okay, that's basically it. Final thing, the discussion.
Yeah, so I think one thing that we try to do with this paper is to show that machine learning can empirically test theories about visual culture, and more specifically, that you don't always need to turn to like big AI systems that are sometimes very difficult to explain what's going on within the black box, but that you can also turn to techniques that have been around for, well, 20 years already, I think, maybe even longer, and that they're still valid. And this doesn't necessarily, we believe, that you don't always have to jump on the next most flashy thing, but also can turn to the proven things from the past and reuse these tools again. Also, this is maybe part of and this is connected to the first point, is that we try to look at, well, we looked at color as a formal element of Orientalism here that moves beyond content. And I think as visual historians, or maybe historians in general, we often focus very much on the content, what is written maybe, or what is visualized, but not so much how it is visualized. And there could be all kinds of information stored in structures in the data that are also telling about the way it is produced, the reason it was produced, etc. And there are many strands in history that look at these elements. I think book historians often look at these things as well. But often in when applying digital computational techniques, we overlook these aspects and we immediately go into the discourse analysis, for example. We showed that medium specificity matters. Autochromes and photochromes showed the world in genuinely different colors. And as Thomas just said, the medium also gave, well, some media gave more agency to the printer itself. And that is already interesting as well. How much agency do we have over what is being outputted? And this again gets into this long-standing debate in history about agency and structure mediated through technology. And I think, of course, we stop now at the early 20th century, but this mediation of color continues up until today. We had printing techniques like the Kodachrome in the 1930s. From the 90s onwards to digital photography that has really shaped how photographs look. If you now look at an image you took 20 years ago with your digital camera, it's very typical of that time, I think. Whereas then it looked like a very neutral image almost. But more recently, the role of Instagram filters on how we present the world. And I think more recently, we have these generative AI systems that can generate images that also bring their own possibilities of and constraints, like how do they use colors when representing the world. And just for this presentations, I made two small examples where I asked Google Gemini to generate an image of an Oriental image and a Occident image. And interestingly, we don't see the Middle East here, but we see the Far East, Japan, Tokyo probably, or Kyoto. And we see Paris, but the colors are sort of similar, I think, in these representations. Of course, this is just a small example, but this also to us brings up all kinds of questions, how we can possibly extend this study to also incorporate other media technologies beyond the photochrome and the autochrome. I guess that was it, right? Shall I close the presentation or do you want to keep it open?
I leave it up to you.
Yeah, maybe well, we can share it again,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
for questions,
Yeah.
perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah.
Super. Well, thank you both so much for this incredibly fascinating presentation. I personally have post-it notes full of questions, but I will hold off on those for a moment because I see we've already got one in the chat. So I'm just going to pass straight over to that and read it out. So you mentioned the difficulty of identifying close colors in the RGB cube. Would your analysis be significantly different if you plotted your colors into HSB, so hue, sorry, saturation, brightness? Pixels with close hue values will look similar independently from saturation and or brightness. Some analysis could possibly be done purely on a linear hue scale.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We so there is some debate on how the RGB space is not linear in the sense that if you move uh, well one step in the space for our eyes, it would mean more than just one step because our eyes are attuned to certain colors more than others. So for that, we use something called LAB. Um, uh, what does it stand for again? Luminosity. It's a different scale like RGB, and I ran the whole experiment on that as well, and the results were basically the same. So that corresponds to hue, saturation, and brightness in a way, but it's not directly related to hue, saturation, and brightness. So maybe running that on those values exactly would also be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe should we go move on to the second question?
Terrific. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so I'll just read it out quickly. Brenda
Yeah.
says, how does your methodology handle any noise introduced with the original photographs having been photographed, scanned, or otherwise digitized?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. So this is basically a thing where we are not quite sure of these effects. So there might be effects of digitization, photographing of. They are not photographed themselves. We know that, right? So we know something about the collections. They were all scanned in. So the photochromes were scanned in by the National Library of Congress, and the autochromes were scanned in by the Albert Kahn Museum. But there might have been effects over time on the colors. The only thing that we know is that because they both come from two collections which have long been in collections, that these effects are probably similar to all our images, right? So they are not sort of collections that are derived from multiple sources. They have always been one collection. So this is something we can assume that they have sort of the same the damage being done as a result of this long scale storage. And also, I think our results, which are both in a way positive and negative, right? So for some questions, we can see that we can make this distinction, and for others, not. This also shows that colors are the RGB values are in fact a good enough sort of way to make these kinds of predictions, so that they are not really skewed by these sorts of processes of archivization or digitization.
And it's also a little, there are some techniques out there to restore the colors in images. And of course, there's AI techniques, but I'm not sure how much we can trust those, but that you can use reference images that don't have this deterioration and then use that to sort of change the older images to the newer colors. But for these techniques, it's of course quite difficult also because people made, well, we have to redo the technique here and now to get sort of the perfect image or the image that it is here and now. And there were also choices made by the producers that are probably quite difficult to reproduce for is it photochromes, I think? Not for the, I always,
For photochromes.
yeah, for
Yeah.
photochromes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
Thank you. And I imagine also that maybe the degradation of some of the inks for the photochromes is different within that kind of spectrum, right? That some inks degrade differently and faster and more profoundly than others.
Yeah, that might be true. So they are famously like it's sort of very small pieces of potato starch which are differently colored, right? So they react differently to light, and so yeah, you might be true. So we know that they sort of degrade in a very specific way, but especially so this degradation is especially true for the autochromes, which are they are very sort of fragile in that sense. But here the benefit is that they have all been kept in this very well preserved collection of French autochromes. So yeah, there's definitely degradation, but there's not so much as that we cannot run our analysis anymore.
Thank you. Right, we have another question. So, your interest seems to be focused on the human perception of color in the Orient-Occident scale. What would your methodology and your results look like if you examined only paintings? You would at least remove variables of technology. Ooh.
Yeah. Yeah. So here, I think that this might be going a little bit against the grain of the question, but I think we don't want to actually remove the variables of technology, right? I think we are especially interested in these variables. So if we look at paintings, it might be way harder on two levels to do this kind of research because every painter has a different color palette, right? So they might share some color palettes, but they might also be they might be not different enough to be sort of visible in these patterns of data. But I think here we are especially interested. We started out with being, so I'm a media historian, so I'm always interested in everything being mediatized. So I'm especially interested in what these sort of technologies sort of do with our perception of the world. And I think so, therefore, we are especially interested in these technologies and we don't want to exclude them at all.
Terrific. Would the type of paper the photographs were produced on affect your results? For example, shiny finish versus matte, grainy inclusions, etc.
Yeah, it would. So the thing is here, so the autochromes have never they are never printed, right? So they only exist in scans or in plate types. So they are basically glass negative types. No, not negatives. They are basically glass plates. So the photochromes were always printed, but they were all printed by the same company. So photochromes, it was a patented technique by a company which sort of made these images on a mass market scale, and they used the same type of paper to print them on. So these are all derived from the Detroit Photo Club company, and they all use the same type of paper. I think if they would have used, if and this is again, this is sort of goes again, is a little bit connected to the coherence of the collection. So this is a very coherent collection. It is not sort of it does not consist of different types of things. So it's all the same paper, the same company. Yeah.
And also, I think it would impact the results if they would structurally use different paper when representing
Right.
the Orient
Yeah.
than the Occident, which could be the case. But I doubt that this would happen. So if it's sort of random across the collection, then it would be perhaps more difficult for us to get the results. So then the accuracy might be lower in that sense. But I guess in distinguishing between the two, yeah, we still get the results. So yeah. Um, but one thing that we could, well, what you sometimes do when doing this machine learning is to what they call augment the images. So we could add noise to the images, make them more glossy or matte, take parts out of the image. But since we're only looking at the dominant colors of the image,
Yeah.
you would probably get those out anyway, even if a part of the image would be destroyed by water or damage. Well, maybe the very dominant image would be in that tiny little part of the image, but then again, we've done this on thousands of images, or hundreds for some of them. But so yeah, if there would be a structural thing here, that yeah would be very interesting, I think.
Thank you so much. I think James, you were first. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. That was great. And there was I have a kind of related question, but it takes us back to your cube, your 512 bucket cube. So talking about both media types. So if you bear with me for a moment, so like autochromes start with light, right? So they start with an infinite potential spectrum of color, and they're then printed, which constrains the potential spectrum of color based on printing. And then photochromes start with an ideation of color, right? And then presumably a palette of potential colors and all the intermixes they can have when they're printed together to then produce color. So I guess what's interesting to me there is like they start from different perspectives, and that's clearly where you get to with one of your arguments towards the end, around the imagination of the Orient, and starting with the ideation of color presumably gets you there. What I was interested with the buckets then is around that you mentioned optimizing the buckets to get to your 512, and it kind of got me thinking about whether that optimizing was happening across both collections or whether it was sort of, shall we say, better fitted to one than the other a little bit? Because I can kind of imagine a world in which, and maybe this is tricky because you had a smaller data set, but I can kind of imagine a world in which photochromes might cluster a bit more in that bucketing because they're based on a more limited sense of color, if that makes sense, whilst autochromes might be more thinly spread across a set of buckets. For not just think about Orient and Oxford, but like in any type of autochrome, because they do start with that idea of the infinite spectrum of light. And I wonder if you could just say something a little bit about that bucketing process and how it sort of fits across some media that come from colors from imagination and some media that comes from colors from light as a starting point. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it makes a lot of sense, Jason, but maybe just like a small correction, like the outcomes were never printed. So there, what you said is correct, but they were never like, so we never get like a correction of printing. They always stay infinite in their possibility, or it's not exactly infinite, of course, but they are much more like, it's much more a scale and not a finite number of possibilities. And that is definitely true
Yes.
for the photochromes because you have a like 9 or 16 printing plates. So they produce, you can all place them over each other, but that definitely produces a finite number of colors.
Yeah, and also I think in terms of the bucket space, it's probably quite tiny for you to see, but we have a table here that shows it across different uses of dominant colors. So either we extract 8 or 16 and different bucket sizes, going down from 64 to 512, and the accuracy doesn't change that much. So even with a very tiny, well, 64 number of buckets, we still get almost the same results. But as it goes in machine learning, you always report the best result, even if it is only 0.001 better. But this is actually, you're absolutely right that I think for a lot of the images, there's only a small space of the bucket or the bucket cube that is filled, which to us is actually quite interesting. With so little information in a way, just using some dominant colors, you can already separate the media types, possibly also because one of the media types has a more limited space, but also what is represented within this media space, well, at least for one of them, uh, in like a sparsely populated bucket, basically. And that to me was quite surprising because at first I tried to put in all the information without the bucket because I thought if the more data we have, the better. But this actually gave much better results. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. We've got another question in the chat here, which says, with different types of media, if you were to replicate this study using cinema or film set in the Orient, do you think that there will be a difference in color schemes if the director editor were a local from the country instead of a foreigner?
Uh, yes, I actually think it would. So, and this also goes like, and this is especially true for the photochromes, right? So photochromes there, the printer could add color. So basically, what we say here, of course, is that the printers, which were either based in Detroit or in Zurich, so in Switzerland, they had an idea of what the Orient should look like, and this sort of translated into the colors that they used. And I think somebody who was living in the Orient and was also maybe not like a Westerner quote in quotes coming to that place, right? So he didn't have an imagined, a sort of didn't see the Orient as an imagined world. That they would definitely give different colors to their own world. And we know this also. This is all in the article, but we start out with color perception, right? As the colors that we, the ways that we, the words that we actually use for colors, they are heavily dependent on the culture you are from. And I think this is also the case, it would definitely be the case if we would ask somebody who was in the 19th century from the Orient, from an Oriental country living in, like, let's say, Istanbul, for example, and giving colors to their own world, they would definitely use different colors. So, yeah, it's of course, but then that's only true if you have these different, if you have this possibility. So it would not be possible for autochromes.
Yeah, but I think in movies, maybe a parallel would be that you could say, well, a camera captures how the world looks, but of course now there's always use of post color colorization, I think it's called, like in post production. You can see this on Netflix series often that they use very heavy alterations of how something looks. And it would be interesting, probably people have done these studies, how this affects how people represent certain parts of the world. Even if it's like they do daytime shots and make them look like nighttime, or if it's hot when it's actually not, when it's like a gray, cold day, they can make it feel, or well, not feel, they look very hot as if it feels hot. So I think that is sort of a similar process going on there. Uh, but yeah, it's I'm always interested how much the director or the editor, you make that distinction, or you answer in your question. I think there's also the dimension there, like what makes them make this decision. But there's probably film scholars that write on this topic.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to put out a question? We've got a couple of we've got some minutes left. If not, I might jump in, my prerogative as chair. I don't see any hands. So I want to just ask you more, do we know much about the actual kind of, I guess, more kind of social economic history of kind of these inks that are being used for polychrome photography? For example, is there a certain range of colors that are available? Are some cheaper than others? Are some more available than others? Which is perhaps then also impacting on how they're creating these kind of colorscapes. Is it the particular producers are using certain kind of groups of colors because they're kind of more available in the countries where they're working, or they're cheaper, and then that is then also feeding into the kinds of tropes of color that we're seeing in these photos?
Yeah, so this is also a very good question, and this goes back to that these all the photochromes. So the medium that is relevant to your question, they were all produced by a very limited number of companies. So it was in fact very hard for somebody like a local producer to make these, because it was actually a very complicated technique where you had different tint stones, different colors. So photochrome was a very heavily patented and guarded technique. So you can still buy them on all these websites, right? On auctioneering websites. But so we we don't know. What we do know is that they were probably made by different printers, but it might even be the case that all these images in the collection were in fact made by a very limited amount of printers who all worked for the same company with access to the same number of colors or the same palette of colors. And there I did a lot of research there, and we have some idea of which colors they had access to, but we don't know an extremely lot about that. But there's no difference in different producers, because we only had like this very limited number of producers, like one in the US, one in Europe. That's basically it.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Well, I still wait for, oh, Brenda. Okay, super. If you removed the top most dominant colors in your autochromes, might you get more of a nuanced result?
Let me try to see if I get the question. So, like, if we remove the top colors, so you would, I think for the autochromes now, our result is sort of already quite nuanced. So I think like if we remove the top colors, so the most dominant colors in autochrome, our classifier would probably be would be worse in predicting if something is an Oriental or an Occidental picture, but that would have sort of go against what we try to achieve. So I'm not quite sure if I understand the question correctly, but at least for our purposes, I think it would not improve sort of the robustness of the method, so to say. But I'm also looking at
Yeah,
here.
I'm thinking what, because one thing that we thought about, just hypothesizing when we started, is that there might be tiny objects in an image
Yeah.
that might be something that our eyes are drawn to, like, I don't know, a certain bird or whatever that has a very specific color
Yeah.
that might not be a very present color, so not a dominant color. But yeah, so
No, but it's a good addition. So what you say is like, in this sense, composition could affect color use, because, for example, we could say like a lot of sky could influence that. There's definitely more sky always in photographs from Switzerland, or more sand in photographs from the Orient. Yeah, I think that is definitely true. Um, I don't think we accounted for that actually, but I also think if you sort of yeah, but
But in itself already, if you think about the aesthetics, showing sky or showing sand is already,
Yeah, but it's content and not form.
yeah, but the way you use the way you make this distinction between sort of the very bluish sky and the is maybe a little, yeah.
Maybe I will just take your question to see is that these things are always hard. Like if you want to formalize them, it's nice to separate form and content. But of course, I think what your question also shows is that these things are always very difficult. And just to be honest, I don't think we can account for this
But it's
for this possibility.
but it's easy, relatively easy that we not take the top five colors or the top eight, but like the second eight. We take the top 16, but maybe cut off the top colors and then see what the classification does.
Suspicious, yeah.
Yeah, and then just run it again. So because we have it all in code that's also available on our GitHub. That's just a slide added, and then we can basically run the experiment again.
Yep. But thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.
I hope. Oh, James, over to you, please.
Sorry, yeah, it made me think that question and your mention of like small items within an object kind of made me think of the different usages of these mediums as well, because like an autochrome would have been used on a projector, correct? No?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, depends. But it was mostly personal use, so it's a very
Okay. As
collection.
in having a little collection of them and looking at them quite closely.
Yeah, they were always they. Yeah, you could either look at them very closely or project them yourself, and they were also used
Yeah.
sort of in these sort of things. For example, we know that some part of the collection was shown in like sort of in theaters in Paris at the turn of the century. So they were also projected. But yeah, this was just a very sort of yeah eccentric collector who had photographers go all over the world and make these pictures basically for himself. So Albert Kahn never showed them to anybody else, but he basically just wanted them for himself. Yeah.
You know, it just made me think a little bit about the sort of different, because like photochromes presumably in most cases would be printed and stuck up on a wall somewhere. They were not super expensive wares, like so they're accessible and people might have had a few of them. So you can imagine kind of in a way, I'm supporting your point about thinking about palettes in a broader sense, because I think with a photochrome, you can imagine people glancing at them and seeing the general color array of some they may have, whilst with autochromes, it seems like there's a different type of usage whereby it might well be that focusing in on particular bits of bright red in a corner that doesn't show up in your kind of top palettes might actually be more important to engaging with it as the medium as it was used, if that makes sense. So like my point is you have two very similar types of medium to the modern viewer, but actually their usages in so everyday life would have been quite different. And photochromes, I can imagine having some on my wall behind me here, right? And you would just see that general array of color as opposed to you wouldn't necessarily see those sharp blues or reds that might be on a jewel or something. And now I'm being very Orientalist by mentioning jewel.
Yeah. No, you're definitely right. And also, this also makes me think of the effect that these images would have had, right? So, of course, an imaginary world is only imagined if people imagine it. So the distribution of these images is also very important. So we know that photochromes were actually one of the first mass-produced and also mass-distributed colored in photographs. And of course, autochromes, they were made they were expensive, so they were not made by that many people. They were also not seen by that many people. They were maybe seen in theaters, but not by these mass audiences that the photochrome would have had. So, and in that sense, they would have also have had less effect on the imagination of the Orient through color. So that's definitely true. Yeah, it's definitely true. Yeah, yeah. What the only thing is that, of course, that the autochrome is then it's a precursor to other types of color media that are, of course, mass produced. For example, Kodachrome in the 1930s, that also present the world in a specific color palette, but it's also it also is derived from light, so it's mechanical and not colored in. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're at the hour, so I will see if we have any further questions from our group, and if not, I've seen people are already clearly having to move to their next meetings, as is the nature of these things. And if so, we might wrap up for today. Yeah, Brenda. Oh no, you're just clapping. Okay, fabulous. Well, in which case we'll end on such a positive note of applause. And what is left is all of the applause that's coming from the wonderful audience. Is to thank you both so much for this presentation. It was really stimulating, and I've certainly come away with more questions and things to research in my own time. What I will leave everyone with is a reminder that our next paper will be on Tuesday, the 17th of February, and I'm putting a link to that in the chat here, when S. Wright Kennedy from the University of South Carolina will be presenting a paper called Separate but Dead, Mapping Disease and Segregation in New Orleans, 1880 to 1915. So please do join us if you can. And there is, of course, a further program to be looked at on our pages. So I will thank our speakers, Thomas and Melvin, again for this wonderful paper and presentation. I urge everyone to go away and read the actual articles themselves. And we really look forward to seeing you all back here in February.
Great. Thanks. Thanks everybody also for the questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
James, I think we're still recording.